Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the McGowan Theater located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum and producer of the Noontime Lecture Series. Before we begin today's program, I just have a few reminders for you about other programs that are going to be taking place at this location in the near future. Now, if you plan to be in Washington, D.C. for the July 4th festivities, you're definitely going to want to come to the National Archives. This is the only place to be because we own the 4th of July. Starting at 8 a.m., the first 1,000 visitors joining us for the Declaration of Independence reading ceremony on the Constitution Avenue steps will receive a special July 4th celebration t-shirt. The reading ceremony is going to begin at 10 a.m. with special guests John and Abigail Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, Thomas Jefferson, and General George Washington. From 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. inside the building, we want you to celebrate like it's 1776 with numerous family activities and crafts which you'll find throughout the building in the Boeing Learning Center. On Wednesday, July 12th at noon, Sidney Blumenthal, former assistant and senior advisor to President Bill Clinton, will discuss Volume 2 of his four-part series on Lincoln, Wrestling with His Angel, The Political Life of Abraham Lincoln, 1849 to 1856. A limited number of his first volume, A Self-Made Man, 1809 to 1849, will also be available at the book signing. On the following Tuesday, July 18th at noon, journalist and historian Garrett Graff will present an author talk and book signing on his book, Raven Rock, the story of the U.S. government's secret plan to save itself while the rest of us die. Kind of gives you the little warm and fuzzies, doesn't it? To find out more about these and our other programs, as well as our exhibits, please take one of our monthly event calendars, which you'll find in the racks in the theater lobby, or you can visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today is Thunder at the Gates, the Black Civil War Regiments That Redeemed America by Douglas R. Egerton. Dr. Egerton received his PhD from Georgetown University in 1985, and since then he has taught early American history at Georgetown, Colgate University, University College Dublin as a Fulbright Scholar, and at Le Moyne College in Syracuse. His writings examine the intersections of race and politics in the 18th and 19th centuries. He is the author of 7 books, including Gabriel's Rebellion, The Virginia Slave Conspiracies of 1800 and 1802, which won the Scheer Prize for the best book of 1993. His other books include He Shall Go Out Free, The Lives of Denmark Vesey, Death or Liberty, African Americans in Revolutionary America, and Year of Meteors, Stephen Douglas, Abraham Lincoln, and the Election That Brought on the Civil War. He has also written numerous essays and reviews regarding race in early America. Some of the latter have appeared in the Sunday Boston Globe and The Nation. He's also appeared on the PBS series The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, Africans in America, and This Far by Faith. So please join me in welcoming Douglas Egerton back to the National Archives.
Thank you. It's nice to be back. As Doug mentioned, got my graduate degrees here in the 1980s, and I used to come down and listen to book talks at the archives and at Smithsonian, and never imagining that one day I'd be the person standing behind the podium. So it's really great to be back. Doug asked me to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. Whatever is blooming here is getting to my nose and my throat, so I've got my water. If I sound a little hoarse, my apologies for all of that. When I started writing this book, friends, colleagues would say, well, what are you working on now? And I'd say, well, I'm writing a collective biography of the 3 pioneering black regiments from Massachusetts, the 54th, 55th, and 5th Cavalry. And they invariably said, well, hasn't that been done? And the fact is, it hadn't. The last book on the 54th, 60 years old, and it stops after July 18, the big attack on Fort Wagner. That's only 5 months into the regiment's history. They served 26 more months on the Carolina coast. The 55th was in Georgia briefly, and of course they were also in Florida. And the reason why everybody thought the story had been done was because of this movie, Glory, 1989. I assume a lot of you have seen it. As far as I can tell, it's shown in about every high school room in the country. It's a wonderful movie. I confess I own it. I own the soundtrack. I watch it. I cry. It's beautifully done, wonderfully acted. It made Denzel Washington famous, won him his first Oscar. The Harlem Children's Choir does the soundtrack. And like everything Hollywood touches, it gets every aspect of the story almost wrong. Here they're, a lot of you have seen it, here they're getting ready to attack Battery Wagner at dusk, July 18. If you're up on your Charleston geography, you'll notice they're facing the wrong direction. Battery Wagner sat at the top of Morris Island protecting Fort Sumter, protecting Charleston Harbor. So actually it's that way. They have to turn around and head back. So they even attack the fort on the wrong side. The scene that wins Denzel Washington the Academy Award is he's marching around in these kind of torn boots, and he goes AWOL trying to find good boots. The day they arrived at Camp Reedville, outside of Boston, the soldiers got a new uniform, a new pair of boots, an Enfield rifle. They were housed in barracks that had been used for white soldiers, not in tents. So I love the movie, but again, it just kind of gets everything wrong, including attacking the fort on the wrong side. The two really big things it gets wrong. It gives you the impression that virtually the entire regiment is made up of runaway slaves from the South. And of the four main characters, the main black characters in the movie, by the way, none of whom were real people. Three of them are runaway slaves. Denzel Washington's Trip says he's from Tennessee. The soldier who stutters is from South Carolina. Morgan Freeman never says where he's from, but he says he left his wife and children behind in slavery. And the fact is the vast majority of soldiers in this regiment were born free in the North. Now, 1,500 men over the course of the war served in this regiment. Another 1,300 served in the overflow sister regiment, the 55th. 1,200 more men served in the first ever black cavalry unit, the 5th Cavalry. So how do you tell a story when you're talking about more than 3,000 people without just kind of losing the focus? And so I kind of cheated. I chose 14 people to focus on before the war, during the war, after the war. 10 were black, 4 were white. Some died, most survived. And these guys were typical of the unit. So these are 4 of my 14 people I followed during the book. On the far left is Lewis Douglas. He's the eldest son of the great black abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who at the time was living in Rochester. He hadn't yet moved down here to Anacostia. Lewis was 23 when he signed up, very much like his father. Big, good-looking, assertive. The men just loved him. He was a natural soldier. Virtually the day he arrived at the camp, he became a sergeant major, and he was very proud of those stripes. Next to him is the kid brother, Charles Douglas, the youngest son of Frederick Douglass. He was 19 when he signed up. Very much wanted to impress his father. He was one in fact, he's the first person in New York State to enroll in the regiment. There's so few men of the right age in Massachusetts, the right health. Well, it's called Massachusetts 54th. The largest contingent was from Pennsylvania, the second largest from New York, 19 kids from my Syracuse, where I live now, and the third biggest contingent was from Ohio. So young Charles is the first New Yorker to sign up. He's very, very proud. He had great handwriting. Bless him, historians love people with nice handwriting. He became a corporal. The only guy out of 3,000 men who served in all 3 units, 54th, 55th, 5th Cavalry. Here he is in his cavalry uniform. But wasn't the soldier his brother was. And at one point, in fact, Lewis writes a very funny letter to his parents, and he said, Charles just doesn't know how to boss guys around. He gives them orders, and they just kind of look at him. To his right is Stephen Swales, and I chose Swales because he was such a complicated, interesting figure. A New Yorker. He'd been working in a tavern as a waiter in Cooperstown. Good-looking guy, and managed to burn every bridge in New York. Drank too much, stole from the guy he worked for twice, got a coworker pregnant, and never married her. So he needed kind of a new chapter in his life. He was 30 when he enlisted, which made him older than most guys in the regiment. The average age was 24. So there's a lot about him that's not heroic. On the other hand, you'll note how light-complected he was. In fact, he goes into politics in South Carolina after the war, has to keep reminding journalists in South Carolina that he's not white. So he easily could have moved to Buffalo, to Syracuse, changed his name, kind of turned the page that way, joined a white regiment. So he wanted to identify with the black community. And he was just a natural soldier, utterly courageous. Battle never scared him a bit, shot 3 times once in the head. And because of his courage, becomes the first ever black commissioned officer in the entire U.S. Army. Here he is wearing his lieutenant's straps. Commissioned officers wear straps on the shoulder. Non-commissioned officers wear stripes down here on the arm. So he becomes the first ever lieutenant of color in the U.S. Army. Here on the right is Peter Vogelsang. He's the oldest guy in the unit. I guess he's kind of the Morgan Freeman character. He's 46 when he enlists, working as a clerk in a hotel in the Bowery. Had lost his wife, had teenage children, left them in charge with his sister-in-law, and joined the military. And again, being 46 in the 1860s is like being 56, 60 today. And so the day he arrived, he's 21 years older than his kid colonel, Robert Gould Shaw. So Shaw writes to his father and says, we have this old guy who just showed up and he's way too old to make it in the regiment. Shaw writes his dad next week and says, I take it all back. I was wrong. The guy's a natural. The men love him. He becomes, in fact, during the war, kind of a killing machine. Shot through the lung, survives the war, also becomes a lieutenant. So here he is also wearing his lieutenant's stripes and survives to come back in the war. Now, what makes these guys enlist? Because this is interesting. These are all New Yorkers. New York had a property qualification it imposed on black voters. It did not impose on white voters. $250 in real property. And the Douglas boys, they work for Dad. So they're printers, they work for his newspaper. Lewis is also kind of sidelining as a grocer in Rochester. So none of these guys have the property qualification to vote in the state of New York. And thanks to the Dred Scott decision, 1857, they are not citizens in the land of their birth. So why do they put their lives on the line? There's a lot of literature as to why white soldiers, North and South, fight in the war. And of course, one obvious reason is they're drafted. Both sides have a draft. The South has a draft in April of 62. The U.S. follows a year later in 63. But when you look at the letters of white soldiers, especially those from the North, they invariably say things, even after the Emancipation Proclamation. They're fighting to heal the Union, to pull the country back together, to save their country. For the black soldiers and their correspondents, they almost never talk about that. They say they're fighting for 3 things. First, they're fighting to be identified as men. They talk a lot about manhood. And it's not, of course, just the white South. It refers to 40-something-year-old men like Vogelsang as boy. So they're there to show, in fact, they are men. Conservative Northern Democrats were quite positive that blacks would not make effective soldiers. They would endless editorials saying at the first sign of battle, these guys are going to put their guns down and run away. An editor in Cleveland mocked the entire idea of black men in uniform, saying the swords of these charcoal soldiers will protrude between their legs like monkeys' tails. That's Cleveland, Ohio. A Manhattan editor agreed, saying 50,000 white soldiers are worth more than 500,000 black soldiers. They're also fighting to force white America to recognize that they are, in fact, citizens of the United States, to basically overturn the Dred Scott decision. Frederick Douglass, who campaigned for the regiment all across New York, getting young men to sign up, famously said, let the black man get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and a bullet in his pocket, and no power on earth can say he's not a citizen in the land of his birth. And again, New York had a property qualification it imposed on black voters, not on whites. Pennsylvania, which again is the largest contingent in the 54th, not a single black man could vote in 1860 or 64, or in Ohio. And their children faced segregated schools. Streetcars in the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, were segregated. So these guys are fighting to make their claim that they are in fact citizens and equals, and their plan is to survive the war and come back home as activists and get voting rights and get decent schools for their children and integrated streetcars in Philadelphia and New York. And finally, they're fighting to end slavery. Now again, the vast majority of these guys are born free in the North. But a handful had been born to slavery. I'll talk about that in a minute. Plus, a lot of these guys are only one generation out of slavery. So you probably all know the story. When Frederick Douglass ran for freedom as a young man, he left behind siblings. So the Douglass boys understand that down there in Maryland, in fact, one sold into Texas, they've got aunts and uncles who are still enslaved. So their plan is to march south and liberate 4 million black Americans. They plan to be an army of liberation and an army of vengeance. As Frederick Douglass said, he called upon young black men to, quote, shoulder a musket and go south and kill rebels. The one thing Glory gets right is that the big July 18 attack on Battery Wagner, guarding Charleston Harbor, guarding Fort Sumter, really was a trial by fire. But more than that, it was also a test. The 54th was an experiment in using black troops in the North. New York, conservative Democratic Governor Horatio Seymour did not want to raise black troops. So it's a test case. And white Americans, North and South, are really quite unsure as to whether blacks will make effective soldiers. And so these guys understand, they're the guinea pigs. If they falter, if they do what white America thinks they're going to do and put the gun down and run away, Lincoln's experiment in black troops is going to be very short-lived indeed. So these guys understand what they're facing. They get a quarter mile away from Fort Wagner on Morris Island. Quick double time, halfway in the last 200 yards, they just sprint toward the walls. Robert Gouldshaw, their 25-year-old colonel, takes 7 balls in the chest, dead before he hits the ground. Lewis Douglass is up waving his sword, shouting, "Come on, boys, and fight for God." And Governor Andrew, and he's raked with grape shot. It blasts his scabbard away and hammers grape shot pellets into his thighs and his groin. And Lewis Douglass lived, but there would be gangrene, and there would be no children. 42% casualties, 650 guys attacked the fort. 42% casualties. Casualties are killed and wounded. They don't capture the fort that day. They do finally get it in September. They don't capture it this day. They have to retreat. But again, Glory gives you the impression that everybody dies. And of the 6 main characters in the movie, they appear to all die. You don't actually see all their bodies. You do see Rob Shaw's body. And he does die. They do, in fact, bury him in the sand outside of Wagner. Most of these guys, they patch back up and they live, or they send them back to the unit, or in the case of Lewis Douglass, there's simply 2 wounded and they go back home. But their courage electrifies white America. Lincoln proudly decides that this is not just an experiment. He announces he's going to raise, thousands and thousands of black troops. So what these guys do at Wagner just electrifies the nation, and even Democrats in the North who are very kind of concerned about this grow very, very quiet. One guy who doesn't make it, he's not one of my 14, but he's in the book because his story is so sad, and he enlists in my Syracuse. This is the 1860 census record, and see if I can get the pointer to work. Here he is, Charles Reason. He's 21. This is the Onondaga County census for 1860, which is the greater Syracuse area. He's the only person of color on the entire page, listed as a farm laborer, and he says he's from Alabama. He's not, but no matter if you're black in the 19th century, when you're talking to white people, no matter how nice they seem, you lie to them. So he gets a job working on a farm with this guy up here, Asa Tyler. Asa's 73, and here's his wife, she's 70, and then there's grandchildren, 15, 12, and 11. So Asa's son is dead, or he's gone, because that generation is missing. And he's 73, and here comes this kid offering to work as a farm laborer. And then in 63, he joins the 54th, and loses his left arm at Fort Wagner. So the Army had commandeered a house in Beaufort. It's still there. Turned it into a battlefield hospital. So they take Reason, who's now 23, Private Reason, back to this house. And the surgeon and the doctor in charge are a husband and wife team. The woman had gone to Geneva Medical College, so they enlisted together. So the surgeon is her husband, she's the doctor. And they know he's dying, and so she's holding the one hand he has left. And she said, "Is there anybody I can contact? Is there a mother I can contact?" And he said, "I'll tell you the truth." He said, "I'm not really from Alabama." He said, "I'm a runaway from Maryland." And he said, "My mother died, and there's no one left who loves me." And he said, "But it's okay." He said, I'm dying, but I'll see her tomorrow in heaven." And the doctor persevered. She said, "Well, is there a father I can contact?" And Reason said, "No, my mother was the only one who loved me. and she's dead, and I'll see her now. And so the doctor writes in her diary that she held his hand, and they prayed together, and he died. And then she wrote in the diary, and I kissed his white forehead, and she underlined the word white. The light bulb had gone on. Dad was his master. Dad was his owner. Dad never loved him, and the day after Dad died, he ran for Syracuse and died at Fort Wagner fighting for the 54th. I developed favorites in the book. I had two favorites. One is a young man named James Henry Gooding. Gooding was born a slave in North Carolina. And his father was white, but his father was not his master. And slavery produced all kinds of sort of curious relationships. And so the father owned a local kind of county store, and his father apparently loved his mother because he spent decades buying all of his children, and then buying his wife, and then he married her in violation of North Carolina law. So when little James Henry, again, mixed race, is 9 years old, his father buys him, wants him out of the South, carries him to New York, and deposits him with a bag of cash at the New York Colored Orphanage. That's the one burned in '63 by the draft rioters in New York. He gets a really nice education. Then when he's about 19, he's apprenticed to a dentist in New Jersey. And Gooding decides that spending a lifetime yanking out rotten Victorian teeth is just not what he has in mind. Jumps apprentice, goes to New Bedford, and signs on with a whaler. So I had to read all about whalers. They're gone for years. And again, he's a man of color. He's got free papers, but he's a man of color in the late 1850s, and so it's a good time to get out of the United States. So he signs on with a ship called the Sunbeam. This actually is a painting of the Sunbeam. They're gone for 2.5 years. They go to the Arctic Circle. They play baseball on the ice, according to the ship's records. About 2 weeks into the trip, the ship's cook comes down with what the ship's log calls the venereal. Has to be relieved of his duties, and little James Henry promises to be the ship's cook. And he loves being, there's 37 guys on the ship, because it allows him to read all day. He loves Dickens. And he never says, but I'll bet he loves Oliver Twist the most, a story about an orphan boy. So he spends all day reading Dickens, and then at 4 o'clock he has to cook for all the guys and clean up. And it's a really nice life. He's gone for 2.5 years. He comes back, he marries the boss's daughter, the captain's black. Then leads 19 guys out of New Bedford and then joined the 54th. He survives Fort Wagner. But one of the things that Glory gets right is that the government had promised these guys equal pay with whites, and then reneges on that offer. So white privates got $13 a month, plus $3.50 in clothing allowance, so basically $16.50. Black soldiers get $10 minus $3 for clothing allowance, so they're basically getting $7, which is not even half of what $16.50 the white soldiers are getting. So they refuse to accept any money, which imposes enormous hardships on their families back home. And in the movie, it's the Denzel Washington character who says, he's not going to take the money. Actually, in real life, it's Rob Shaw who writes back to his dad and says, we simply can't accept the money until we get full funding for all of our soldiers. So Gooding's got a wife back home, and he's not sending any money back to her because they're not accepting money for more than a year. So Gooding finally gets mad, decides to write to his ultimate boss, Commander-in-Chief Abraham Lincoln. And he says, and this is after the fight at Fort Wagner, and he says, we are not laborers. We are not ditch diggers. We are soldiers. And we insist upon being paid what white soldiers are paid. And Lincoln doesn't respond. But he sends the letter along to the War Department. So Lincoln is aware of what's going on. And finally, in June of '64, thanks to Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, Congress does equal the pay scale for black soldiers and white soldiers and gives those who are still alive their back pay going back to January of '63. So Gooding's kind of grouchy letter to Lincoln plays a role. So he survives Wagner, but his luck runs out at the next big battle at Olustee, Florida. Olustee is about 60 miles west of St. Augustine, which had been captured by U.S. forces. So the 54th, and by this point the 55th, are marching west. Their job is to burn bridges, cut the tracks which are connecting the Western Confederacy with Savannah and Charleston. And one of the Confederate officers at Olustee had told his men that the black soldiers were there for the white wives, and encouraged the men from the Confederacy, not to take any prisoners. So the two sides just kind of run into each other. The tracks are sort of right over here. I took this picture several years ago. You can see it's sandy, it's flat, pine trees, palm trees, no time to dig in. They stand about 20 feet apart and just kind of blast away at one another until one side runs out of ammunition, and that's the United States runs out first. And this is where Stephen Swales is shot in the head. It digs a furrow in his head. He just keeps fighting until he finally passes out from loss of blood. His men put him in a kind of a cart and get him back near the train. And one of those who's wounded is James Henry Gooding. There's a Confederate officer, not the one who told his men to take no prisoners, who hears shooting after the battle and finds a private still shooting, and he says to the young man, "What are you doing?" And the private says, "Shooting Negroes, sir." And of course, he didn't use the word Negro. So a lot of 54th were kind of summarily executed at Old Lusty, but not James Henry. He's shot in the thigh. Bad news, he's sent to Andersonville prison camp. 31,000 U.S. prisoners in this tiny hell in a corner of Georgia. Here it is. The camp commandant, Wirtz, who is the only guy executed by the U.S. for war crimes in the Civil War, really hated what he called white Negroes, people of color and who are mixed race, and of course that's Gooding. So Gooding is put on a work detail called the Negro Squad. Their job is to bury dead bodies. And Gooding refuses unless there's also white prisoners on the burial squad. And for that crime, on July 19, 1864, Confederate guards beat him to death. It's a year and a day after the attack on Fort Wagner. It's 1 month shy of his 25th birthday. They're buried with the stake in the ground and a number on the stake, but a U.S. captive, a clerk, is keeping track of what name corresponds to what number. And so when the war is over, the War Department and the U.S. government turn Andersonville into a memorial, a park, and they erect gravestones on the site where the stakes were. So this is Gooding's gravestone, and it is in fact above what is his body, thanks to the stake. The other guy I really fell in love with writing the book was the man who was the lieutenant colonel of the 54th before Rob Shaw's death and became the colonel after. Colonel Edward Needles Hallowell went by the nickname of Ned. Here he is. He loved that mustache. He's talked a lot in his letters about caring for the mustache, trimming the mustache. He's very, very proud of this mustache. Came from a large, loving Quaker family in Pennsylvania. And of course, Quakers were pacifists, but his family were also abolitionists, and they were feminists. One of his brothers was married to the granddaughter of Lucretia Mott, the feminist who was in Seneca Falls in 1864. The family had been hiding slaves before the war, and they're fascinating. They love each other. They write endless correspondence, which is great for historians, but they still use the old 18th century thee and thou when writing to one another. So he's the lieutenant colonel at Wagner. I guess he's kind of more or less the model for the Cary Elwes character in the movie Glory, who's known as Cabot Forbes. There was no Cabot Forbes in the movie. Injured at Antietam, shot in the groin at Fort Wagner. They just patch him up, send him back to the front. So here he is leading his men. And of course, Quakers don't mind a nice drink. And what Ned Hallowell loved was a nice bottle of wine. So by the end of the war, the 54th and the 55th are overrunning these giant plantations down in coastal Carolina. The first thing that Ned does is find the owner of the estate, tells them that he's now a U.S. prisoner, and asks where the wine is. They usually bury it in the basement. So the first thing they do is they go down to the basement and they start digging up wine. He comes for money. So he's not sending back much in the way of loot. He does get a silver ladle for his mother he thought was kind of pretty. But his letters are filled with, last night we liberated a 38 Madeira. We just liberated the greatest cask of port. So he liked his drink. The guy working kind of hand in glove with him was a sergeant major from the 55th, James Monroe Trotter. Here is Trotter on the right. What I have in my book may or may not be correct, because I was talking to a historian who has kind of a different take on Trotter's life. Trotter's story is that he was born a slave in Mississippi. His master was his father. And the story he tells is his master loved his mother, loved him and his two siblings, and brought them to Chillicothe, Ohio, and freed them. They went back to Mississippi, which I'm now hearing may be a fiction on the part of Trotter. So they have kind of overlapping jobs. So when they go to the plantations, Ned tells the master that he's now a prisoner and wants the wine. Trotter's job is to call all the slaves together and announce they are free. Trotter says you can stay, you can come, you can go. If you want to stay here, we'll work out some kind of labor contract. If you want to go, we'll protect you as you move toward Charleston. And of course, because Trotter had been a slave, he knew people in the South. And he wrote a letter and he said, the whites I spoke to were always really polite when I talked to them. He said in part because I always kept my right hand on my big Colt revolver. They're still on the coast in Carolina when word arrives that Lincoln's been shot at Ford's Theater. And Ned wrote his mother that night and said, "Tomorrow, thy son is going killing and burning. We plan to avenge our fallen leader." That was one angry Quaker. He survived the war, but was never really healthy after the war. A lot of these guys were just not really healthy after the war, which reminds us, historians get involved in this debate, is how many Americans died during the Civil War. And one of the things that makes it hard to tell is a lot of these guys, they die after the war, but they're never really healthy after the war. So Ned does return home to Philadelphia. He marries. He fathers 2 children, 2 daughters, but he dies at the age of 34. 1870, he's just never really healthy after the war. He's just been shot too many times. And the obituary says he was the best fighting Quaker that one could imagine. So most of these guys do survive the war, or I should say also, Trotter settled in Boston. His son, William Monroe Trotter, became one of the founders of the NAACP together with Dr. Du Bois. So it was kind of the father of this sort of great family. They're there in Charleston for the big rededication ceremony of Fort Sumter in April of '65 when the flag is put back up. And a lot of the soldiers talked about standing up on the seawall and looking off to the right because that's where Battery Wagner stood. And so they're looking off at what's left of that sandy fort where so many of them had fought and bled 2 years before, and so many of them were still buried, including Rob Shaw, buried in the sand outside of the fort. So they're the honor guard there on that day when the flag is put back up in April of '65 at the end of the war. Most came back home, and here is Lewis with his fiancée, Helen Amelia Logwin Douglas. She was the daughter of a Kentucky runaway who'd settled in Syracuse and became a very important upstate New York AME minister. His house, which is fortunately gone, it's now a Rite Aid, is about a mile from my campus. And they were engaged before the war. And she'd been teaching school in Binghamton, but what she really wanted to be was a wife and mother. And she could still be a wife, but because of Lewis's wounds, she could not be a mother. And she kept him waiting for 4 years. And he wrote very, very sad letters to her. "What about your promises to me?" And finally, in 1869, they did marry, and they had a very long, loving, happy marriage, but of course, there were no children. Surviving the war also, one of my 14, is the man in the middle, and then is an older man on the right, and that's William Carney Jr. Carney actually was a runaway. He'd been an enslaved oysterman near Norfolk, and got out probably with the help of white oystermen. Got to New Bedford, became friends with James Henry Gooding, joined the war. He's training for the church when he joined up. And of course at Wagner, the flag bearer went down. And then Rob Shaw picked up the flag, and then of course he's shot. So Carney picks up the flag, is waving the American flag, shot in the right leg, still waving the American flag, shot in the left hip, still waving the flag, shot in the right shoulder. The retreat is called. He's shot in the chest. Spins around, is crawling down the beach, one hand over his wound, one hand holding the flag. Grape shot hit him in the back of the head. He crawls 3/4 of a mile down the beach, hands the flag off to white soldiers and said, "Boys, I did my duty. The old flag never touched the ground." In exchange for that, he became the first Black Congressional Medal of Honor winner. Here he is wearing, of course, his medal. Not given until 1900 by William McKinley, but he does become the first Black Congressional Medal of Honor winner. Here he is holding the flag. So survived, but was, of course, disabled, could never walk without 2 crutches. Got a nice job of all kinds of strange things, is sort of an errand runner. He couldn't move very well in the Boston State House, and then died in a freak elevator accident in 1908 when the door kind of closed on him as he was trying to step out of the way, but was always very proud, and was huge on the GAR the circuit after the war. I mean, the white soldiers just loved this guy as much as black soldiers loved him. Carney was still alive in May of 1897 when Boston put up the Robert G. Shaw Memorial. I assume probably a lot of you have seen it. It's on the Commons. If not, next time you go to Boston, make sure you stop and see it, because it's Rob Shaw on his horse and his men on either side, and they're marching back away from the Commons. The guys here are marching the way they did in '63 as they left Boston for the Carolina coast. And the original plan for the monument was simply Rob Shaw up on a horse. And his mother, Sarah Shaw, was still alive. Went to the Planning Commission. She said, Rob was never really a soldier like a Grant or a Sherman. She said he was a kid, and he was an anti-slavery kid. She said the story really is about the men in the regiment. And I tried to make my book about the men in the regiment and not simply about Rob Shaw. So at his mother's request, there he is on his horse, but the men are around him. And on the back of the memorial are the names of all 1,500 men who served in the 54th. So here's the big dedication ceremony. Lewis Douglas is marching in the group. The white man waving the hat, that's Penn Hallowell, the brother of Ned. Ned was dead by this point, who led the 55th. Stephen Swales is in the group and still carrying the U.S. flag, is William Carty, crutch in one hand, flag in the other. I'll show you one more image, which is in the book, and then we can go to take some questions. In the 1920s, a white photographer decided to kind of travel around the South, mostly filming kind of the black community. And here he is filming an unknown family in Tennessee, and they are upper middle class family. You can tell their house is very bare, but against the 1920s in the South. But they're upper class or upper middle class because of the way they're dressed. Note how they're presenting themselves, showing their children books. Not much on the walls, but a picture above the mantle. If you can kind of puzzle out what that is, it's a picture of the Shaw Memorial in Boston. So we don't know who these people are. Was she the daughter? Was he the son of somebody who served in the 54th? But even as white America forgot about their heroism, black America always kept the story alive. The last chapter of my book deals with kind of the aftermath. Every time there's another war, Spanish-American War, World War I, white America engages in the same debate as always. Can blacks be efficient soldiers? And the black press always pushed back and said, don't forget Fort Wagner. Don't forget Lusty. And this family, whoever they are, did not forget what happened at Battery Wagner. So we finish this way. Again, these guys understand they are the test. They are the experiment. And they saw themselves as liberators. By the end of the war, 179,000 black men served in the U.S. Army, about another 20,000 in the U.S. Navy. Of that figure, 141,000, like William Carty, like Gooding, had been born into slavery, but put on that blue uniform and fought for a country that did not recognize them as citizens. So by the end of the war, these guys had a lot of help. They had the help of that tall man in the White House. They had the help of progressives in Congress like Thad Stevens and Charles Sumner. But in a very real way, those 650 guys who sprinted down the beach that July 18, bullets whizzing around them, those men in the end were the real great liberators. Now we have time for questions. You probably know this is a mural here in town at the pension office from the New Deal era. And there's Carney up there, and there, of course, is Rob Shaw dying. But that's here in town. It's also the cover of my book. But, yes, sir.
Hi, I'm a Civil War buff, so this has really been fascinating. Just curiosity, just as a point of clarification, Carney became a postal clerk. And I find it interesting that he was shot so many times and he had problems walking.
Yeah.
But he was a postal clerk for 30 years. And the medal, incidentally, is still in his family. Because I'm a curator at the Smithsonian, and we had an exhibit where we actually showed the medal. The other question...
It would be great in my office. So just toss that out as an idea.
He's not giving it up.
All right, okay, fair enough.
Guys, his ancestor, I forgot it. I think it was well, anyway, he's not giving it up. The second thing I want to mention is that I noticed you didn't mention a lot about the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry. Just curious, Saltville, the massacre.
Yeah.
A guy named Champ Ferguson, who was later hanged, thank God, for the massacre there. Was he involved in the massacre? Because there's some people who say that Ferguson was not involved in the massacre. And how many troops were actually killed at Saltville?
And I don't know precise answer to your question about whether he was involved. Saltville in Virginia was a hospital that was overrun by Confederate troops because there are salt mines in Virginia, where wounded U.S. soldiers and black soldiers were slaughtered by Confederates. I can't tell you who exactly gave the order. The 5th Cavalry does get a chapter in my book because, again, that's where Charles winds up. And Charles actually does see action down near Petersburg. He's not at the Battle of the Crater, but he actually does see battle down near Petersburg. And he's not crazy about it. He's much happier being a clerk. What's interesting about the 5th Cavalry is that most of these guys are, in fact, unlike the 54th, they are former slaves. Because black men in the North who work with horses are delivering milk, they're draymen, that kind of thing. So what the unit needs to get are basically guys who are in charge of their master's expensive steeds. And so they mostly recruit guys who are contraband here in D.C., who've gotten out of Virginia, North Carolina, gotten this far, and really know horses. And so most of the 5th Cavalry, which is actually led by Charles Francis Adams Jr., who's one of my 14 guys, he's the grandson of John Quincy Adams and the son of Charles Francis Sr., who's a diplomat in Europe at the time, and a terrible person, incidentally, Charles Francis Jr. He's quite awful. So yeah, they are in fact more like black soldiers in the movie Glory, because these guys are in fact runaway slaves who kind of really know horses. So that's a non-answer to your question, I know, but there is stuff on the 5th in the book, just not about Saltville. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your words. My question is, what did you find most interesting throughout your research about Frederick Douglass's role in advocating for Black Americans serving in the armed forces, and also what did you find interesting about Frederick Douglass's interactions with government officials such as President Lincoln and Secretary Stanton on the topic? I know that he had some meetings, but I know with Lincoln, but I think with Stanton also maybe.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. And of course, Lincoln was really, really anxious that black Americans be allowed to serve, precisely so they could make this kind of claim to be citizens. Campaigned all across the North. And one of his biographers says that he'd sacrificed his sons for his latest cause, which I think is just completely unfair for all concerned. I mean, Charles, again, is 19, Lewis is 23. These guys know what they want to do, so they're not being pressured by dad. But their father really was determined that black Americans be allowed to serve, again, as a way to kind of stake a claim to being citizens. So he does actually have several meetings with Lincoln, and one is over the pay question, and of course, until the very end of the war, black men were not allowed to become commissioned officers. So the lieutenant straps, Swales, and Trotter are wearing, those are like the last really days of the war. And the meeting is interesting because, again, Lincoln's a work in progress. Lincoln was always kind of moving into kind of a more progressive position, but it took him a while to get there. So he goes down and he meets with, Douglas meets with Lincoln and Stanton about the pay issue. And Douglas begins to explain who he is. And Lincoln says, no, Mr. Douglas, I know who you are. Mr. Seward has explained to me who you are. And Lincoln basically says, look, I've got Democrats in Congress who don't want to have black soldiers, let alone black soldiers who make less money than white soldiers. And so he said, you got to sort of give me a break. I'm moving as fast as I can. But then Lincoln says to Douglas, but I promise you this, I never take a step back. So we're moving in the right direction and we're going slowly, but I never take a step back. And so, and frankly, the issue really is Congress, not Lincoln and the War Department, because Congress does pass a militia act that has a segregated pay scale for black Americans. That said, Ned Hallowell, the brother, writes his memoirs, and Ned never really forgives Lincoln for not pushing harder for equal pay for black soldiers. And again, if you're watching Glory and they turn down their mind and you think, well, this is great, this guy's really standing strong, but then you forget these are working class guys. And their wives back home who really need that pay. And I came across a lot of really sad letters from wives saying, yeah, I know, honey, you're trying to make a point here. I support you, but I need to pay the rent. So Lincoln was moving, but he's moving more slowly than he would think. And by the end of their lives, Douglas and Lincoln had kind of a grudging respect for one another. Spielberg doesn't need my advice on how to make movies, but if I was making Lincoln, the third last meeting is Lincoln's second inaugural. And I would have had that scene, and not looking at the theater. We all know he's going to die at the theater. We don't need to see that. but I think probably that's kind of too much testosterone on the screen to see Douglas and Lincoln there together on the big screen. Make a pitch. My wife, shameless pitch on my part, has a new book out called Women in the World of Frederick Douglass. It is fantastic. If you want to know about Douglas, the women in his life, Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, new from Oxford. The author is Lee Faught. Faught is in like the past tense of to fight, and also my cute wife. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Egerton. I've enjoyed the talk, and you've almost stolen my question. As I was listening to you, one of the things I got to thinking about, because you mentioned it several times, is the wives. And I'm just wondering, what, if anything, have you uncovered about the story of the wives of these black Americans during the Civil War? Because there has to be a lot there. They may not have picked up a gun, but I know they had to have been doing something very dramatic to sustain themselves and the effort.
Now, you're exactly right. And in fact, chapter 6 of my book, which follows the chapter on Wagner, is called Hospitals and Home Fronts. And so it deals with these guys who are wounded and what their wives are going through. Because and there's a real gulf. The white guys come from money. Rob Shaw actually has a wife. She's not in the movie, but he's actually married. And of course, they're coming from money, so their wives aren't facing that kind of hardship during the war, whereas the working class black wives are. What I found interesting is that a lot of the black women are not really anxious for their fiancés and husbands to enlist in this cause. And Amelia Logan, Lewis's fiancée, keeps writing him to say, look, white America doesn't want you. Why are you risking your life for these people? Basically, I need you back here at home. And so I was reminded, as I was writing the book, that the women at home are facing a different kind of struggle, but almost as enormous and profound as that faced by the guys on the front lines. And of course, the last place you want to be in the Civil War is in a battlefield hospital, because they're dirty, there's blood, and so the second they get these guys out of the hospital, they get them back home. And so that's their wives become, or their daughters, mothers become nurses, doctors. Ned Hallowell's sister writes a letter in which she's trying to shave around his elaborate mustache. And then, of course, there is today, I guess this starts with World War II, a special Army Corps that comes to the house if a soldier has passed away. And that's not in the Civil War. And so it's up to papers to publish the names of dead and wounded soldiers. And I came across other letters where people say, I went out to the mailbox, and I saw the newspaper there, and the headline was Casualties from Antietam, and I just kind of didn't want to look because I'm afraid I will find Rob Shaw's name there, that kind of thing. So the waiting, I think even more than in modern wars, has to be sort of really, really dreadful for these women. So they're really sacrificing in a way. And again, the first guys to get to Reedville get there in January of '63, and they don't get equal pay until the summer of '64. So that's a really long time when these working class wives are doing without it. And one woman, actually, this is really terrible, writes to her husband and says, I sold my body. I mean, I need to feed the children, and you need to accept whatever they offer you. And that's, imagine you're down there on the coast in Carolina risking your life in this awful litter of wives because the government is not doing the right thing for you or your family. And that puts these guys in just this kind of terrible, terrible position. So that's one of the really kind of tragic parts of the story.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
You referenced a lot of letters that you've read.
Yeah.
Where did you find them? How did you come upon them?
There are different places. The Hallowell letters, Penn Hallowell's letters. The question was, where do they find the letters? They asked me to talk into the microphones. Penn's letters are at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Ned's letters are at Haverford, the Quaker College outside of Philadelphia. The Douglas letters are at the Library of Congress, and then also in a private collection in Savannah. I was talking to Doug before our talk that the Douglas family, after Dad died, sued one another, sued their stepmother, sold a lot of the correspondence, and so a wealthy surgeon actually in Savannah has been acquiring Douglas letters, and is very, very generous about letting scholars come and sit in his parlor and read these letters. So they're kind of scattered all over. And again, one of my 14 guys was Charles Francis Adams Jr., and Mass Historical has all their letters on microfilm, bless them, which is really easy to look at. So they're sort of here and there. A lot of the Trotter letters are at Cornell University, which is down the road for me. So they kind of wind up in odd spots. And then, of course, in this building, the pension files are just fantastic. And the more you're shot, the bigger your file is. So Stephen Swale's file, because they have drawings of the bodies, shot here, shot here, shot here, that kind of thing. So the pension records upstairs here in the archives were an amazing resource.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
We have a cemetery in St. Cloud, Florida, which is right near Kissimmee, near Disney. It has about 450 Union soldiers buried there. It's way south of Ulusty, but these were men that came and retired in Florida. And most of them went back north, about 4,000 settled in there by 1915 or so. In the cemetery, there's at least 3 black soldiers. Now, some of them are, it says USCT, one of them at least, and another one says 54th Massachusetts. Why the difference in nomenclature?
That's a really good question. So again, the 54th is the first federal northern black unit. And while they're training, the Congress then gets on board and decides to create the whole USCT, U.S. Colored Troop structure. And so there's a couple of random units. There's one in Florida that's a conscript unit. There's one out in Kansas. And so they become USCT units, and they get a whole new designation. To hold on to kind of pride of place as being the first unit, 54th, 55th, 5th Cavalry, never become a USCT. So they remain state-sanctioned units under the War Department auspices until the end of the war. So actually, technically, they're the 3 units that are never USCT. And there are some USCT guys from Kentucky at Ulusty. So that's probably the guy who's buried. He's one of the USCT guys who are kind of too green to be fighting, and they don't do all that well at Ulusty.
I wondered also, thank you. I wondered also about the Grand Army of the Republic, their treatment of black veterans and the pensions.
Yeah. I mean, the pensions were fairly easy to get. The one hurdle that black soldiers, especially USCT soldiers, faced. You had to list your beneficiaries. You had to list, who would get the money when you got married, and of course for a former slave who was married in Virginia before the war, there's no document. So they have to get all these kind of long letters saying I was married by a black preacher named so and so, which again is why the pension files are so great. Here's where we got married, who was there at the wedding, that kind of thing. But there's not really that much discrimination between who's getting the pensions, white or black soldiers. And again, by the 1890s, because virtually everybody in Congress from the North had served in the war, the GR becomes this kind of great lobbying machine. If you have any wounds, even not related to the war, you can get a pension by the 1890s. So that's pretty easy to get. How these guys are treated by GR chapters depends on where they are. The whites in the Midwest kind of never really are excited about black service. New England, pretty much so. So Carney is a big speaker on the GR circuit, Pennsylvania, New York, New England, but he's never invited to go out to Ohio. So, and in fact, there's a white GR chapter in New England named after Carney. So for the guys in New England, yeah, that just kind of erases, they recognize the heroism, and it erases their concern about the race.
Thank you.
Still have 8 minutes if anybody else has one last question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, one final question. Fort Wagner.
Yeah.
Okay, it was the scene where they were actually started to run towards Fort Wagner,
Yes.
Battery Wagner in the Civil War. In glory. As I understand it, I think Strong was the BG
Yeah.
for that unit. As I understand it, they advanced to the fort quicker than they had expected.
Yeah.
So the white units weren't able to catch up with 54th and the 55th, and that's why that first, as I understand it,
Yeah, there's different.
that's
yeah.
why the first time, that's why they were defeated. Because there was no, they got there quicker than they should have.
Well, there's different views as to what exactly happened. Now, to start with, again, a battery has 3 sides, a fort has 4. So again, Battery Wagner is this giant sand fort supporting Fort Sumter. So the side that faces Sumter doesn't have a wall at all. So the wall is facing Charleston is over there. And so these guys are coming from the southern side of Morris Island. So here's the big sandy wall. And there was a bomb-proof. Bomb-proof is basically kind of a giant bomb shelter inside the fort. So the Navy had been bombing for 2 days, starting at 10 in the morning till sunset. And so their assumption was that they killed a lot of the guys in the fort. And in fact, they're all safe down in this kind of giant, it's a huge bomb-proof. There's pictures of it, there's one in the book. It's kind of an enormous fort. They dig a giant hole in the sea, the sand, use railroad ties, put sand on top of that. So the bombs that are landing are just kind of moving the sand around. So the strong figures, they're down to 300 guys in the fort, and there's actually 1,700 guys in the fort. They also attack at low tide, so there's more space between the water and the kind of hard-packed sand. But even so, some of the guys on the right get pushed down into the water. So the white officers later on say, we didn't send more support troops. There's Connecticut guys who are right behind them, and they take a huge beating. Also, the New York 48, they're farther back still. They also take a beating. The white officer says there's just the congestion was too great. We couldn't get them all down there. Lewis Douglas says not a chance. They actually were inside the fort fighting for an hour. And Lewis said, if they'd sent more troops, we would have captured the fort that night. So a lot of the guys who were there, also Penn Hallowell. Penn Hallowell said if they just kept sending guys down the beach, we would have taken the fort. And it would have been kind of a bloody mess, but we would have taken the fort. And Strong, who you're talking about, the kind of support general, goes riding out to try to bring in some of the wounded troops and is shot in the thigh and gangrene sits in. He's buried in Brooklyn, pretty close to where my daughter lives. So it's a bloody mess. But a lot of the guys who were there thought it could have been done had it been done right. So that's a really good question. All right, I'm getting the sign from Doug. So thank you all so much for coming and for listening.
Don't forget, book signing is one level up in the Archives bookstore, 15%, that's 15, not 50, 15% discount today.